Now as we move into the next section, our goal is to explain how the war ended, to list the costs of the war to the United States. So, Nixon turns over the war to South Vietnamese. This is following a policy that is known as Vietnamization. And so it's more of a gradual turning over. We begin to scale back and expect the South Vietnamese to do more to fight the war on their own. Henry Kissinger, meanwhile, negotiates for the United States. Ultimately, the POWs are released in 1973, and we withdraw our troops. So Americans leave, and the communists continue to advance on the South. Now, Nixon, of course, goes through what becomes known as the Watergate scandal, something we'll look at in a coming chapter. With Nixon's resignation, Gerald Ford becomes the U.S. president, and Ford has to decide what to do in the aftermath. By this point in time, the Gulf of Tonkin resolution has been repealed. The president really no longer has the authority to do much of anything. Ford wanted to help South Vietnam. He wanted to intervene on their behalf, but Congress would not allow it. So ultimately, we kind of sit by as North Vietnam overruns the South in 1975. So now kind of looking at the finale, at its time the Vietnam War was the longest in U.S. history with a total price tag of $200 billion. As a result, tons of military hardware left behind. 3.5 times more bombs were dropped than we dropped during World War II. 3 million people were killed and 1 million wounded. Now, of course, that's combined on all sides, but still it's a staggering loss of life. 30 years later, the trade embargo with Vietnam was lifted back in 1994. President Clinton visited Vietnam in the year 2000, and the evidence of the U.S. presence was everywhere. Reasons why the Americans got out: the guerrilla warfare, the tunnels and booby traps, and mostly the morale at home. Looking at Vietnam today, they've had over 30 years as one nation. In fact, now going on almost 40 years as one nation. They are united under communism, although we've seen them move much more towards a free market type economy, thanks to economic pressure. Looking at Ho Chi Minh's legacy, Ho Chi Minh died in 1969, so he was not able to see the end of the Vietnam War. But he is considered to be the George Washington of Vietnam, and people visit his body daily in Hanoi. Today, Vietnam has most favored nation trading status with the United States, and they have full diplomatic relations with the United States. Now, looking at the Vietnam veterans, 87% of Americans hold great esteem for the Vietnam veterans, and they have the lowest unemployment rates of all veterans. However, as we mentioned, many Vietnam veterans were not treated very well when they returned. And this actually created a tremendous amount of bitterness on the part of many veterans. But overall, many of them have adapted quite well. The Vietnam War has also played prominently in many movies over the years, including many well-respected famous films, often though these films are critical of war in general, and most are not exactly school appropriate. One example is the movie Forrest Gump, which includes scenes from the war. The movie Apocalypse Now focuses on its story on the horrors of the Vietnam War, and the movie Full Metal Jacket is also another one that depicted the Vietnam War, as well as Good Morning Vietnam with Robin Williams. Now, looking at Vietnam veterans in the government, there are, at least at the time this was created, 13 Vietnam veterans in the U.S. House of Representatives and 5 veterans in the U.S. Senate. The senators John Kerry and John McCain both had served. Now, of course, Kerry has gone on to be the U.S. Secretary of State. Both were war heroes, and both of them ran for the presidency. Kerry ran for the Democratic, or was the Democratic nominee in the 2004 presidential election, where he ran against and lost to George W. Bush. And John McCain was the Republican nominee for president in 2008 when he ran against and lost to Barack Obama. The Vietnam War Memorial is the most visited site in Washington, D.C. 58,000 names are on the wall and was a tribute to those who served and died. Something new that we have had to deal with is what has become known as PTSD, or post-traumatic stress disorder, once called shell shock and post-Vietnam syndrome. It was a new term and diagnosis during the 1980s, and it's associated with severe psychological and emotional war-related trauma. 72,000 Vietnam vets are being compensated. Another issue dating back to the Vietnam War was the use of Agent Orange, which was developed in the 1940s. It was an herbicide that controls plant growth. And of course, one of the problems we had in fighting against the Viet Cong was the use of these, their knowledge of the terrain and kind of hiding in the coverage of the jungles. So we used 6 million gallons that were dumped on Vietnam between 1963 and 1966. Once again, the idea of really trying to kill the plants that provided covering or hiding spots for the VC. Once again, the chemical was shipped in 55-gallon drum barrels that were orange striped, thus the name Agent Orange. Vets exposed to it have exhibited more health problems, and lawsuits total over $180 million since the 1980s, and it has been linked to severe birth defects. Now, kind of looking at the lasting legacy of the Vietnam War, we have new ways to really kind of look at war. Many Americans are a little bit more critical of government and critical of war in general, but we have continued to have involvement with smaller countries. And we now also have to deal with many veterans issues that we previously did not have to deal with.